as we discussed before, each tenant needs to have one VRF or context. This is the same as any other Nexus device. It's just that in ACI, when you create your tenant, you have to also create a VRF. You may only ever have one. You may not ever have the need for two in your environment. Once I have my VRF created, I can now start to create bridge domains. Once again, bridge domains specify how Layer 2 acts for a certain group of devices, how multicast acts for a certain group of devices, as well as the IP space, the subnets, or the default gateways that a certain group of devices are allowed to use. You can also keep in mind that you don't have to have a Layer 3 bridge domain. If you had a group of devices that was only going to be Layer 2, you could use a bridge domain as just a Layer 2 domain as well. In this case, I have two different bridge domains with three different groups. Two of the groups are associated with bridge domain 1, which means that those two groups will be allowed to use any of the default gateways that are listed under bridge domain 1, whereas EPG3, or the third group, will only be allowed to use the default gateway underneath bridge domain 2. If I want any of these EPGs to be able to talk to each other, I then have to create a contract between these groups of devices to allow them to communicate. My contract can be very strict to the point where I'm only opening certain ports between different groups of devices, or it could be very open where I say any communication between EPG1 and EPG3 is allowed. I also have the capability to be able to turn off all of my contracts on an individual VRF, and that's called unenforced mode. So for instance, I could go to that VRF that I created and I could put it in unenforced mode, and then by default, all of the groups of devices in that VRF would be able to talk to each other without a contract. Now I will say that I don't normally see that. What I normally see is that we keep the VRF in enforced mode, apply the security, and then create contracts, if I want to be very open with my security, that allow any communication between a group of devices and another group of devices. I may even reuse that contract over and over again, and that allows communication between any group of device within that VRF. Then later on, I can go in and modify that contract to lock it down or create new contracts to be more strict with my security. I could also create a second tenant, and in this case, I could actually create two different VRFs or two different contexts. In this case, I still have my two different bridge domains that contain a number of different groups, and I still use contracts to control how groups within the same VRF would talk to each other, as well as contracts to control how groups across different VRFs can talk to each other. But I have that capability to separate out the networks if I want to. So in summary, a bridge domain is a Layer 2 domain built with VXLAN overlays. And a bridge domain is always associated with a VRF, and we need to have at least one VRF per tenant. So in the very least, we could have a tenant with a single VRF and a single bridge domain, and then multiple groups underneath that bridge domain. We then take that bridge domain, or IP space, and then we carve it up into different groups in which we put physical and virtual servers to control how they talk to each other through contracts. It's perfectly acceptable as well to have a single bridge domain associated with a single endpoint group or group of devices, and another bridge domain associated with another group of devices. So for instance, if I'm using network-centric mode, I may have VLAN 10, which uses the subnet 1.1.1.0, and that VLAN 10 may be the only group associated with that bridge domain. And then I can create another bridge domain that's 2.2.2.0, and that's VLAN 20. And I create a group called VLAN 20, and I associate it with that bridge domain. And then I create a contract that controls how VLAN 10 can talk to VLAN 20. But I may only have one subnet or one default gateway in a bridge domain, and then associate a single group with that bridge domain. I also have the capability to associate multiple groups with a single bridge domain, and that's perfectly acceptable as well. This concludes Lesson 10.